It's time to work on the 3 jack-o'-lanterns for our Pumpkins and Potions quilt. It's time for the jack-o'-lanterns on page 15. All of my fabrics have been backed with fusible interfacing and I have the batting. I did not cut these pieces with my ScanNCut, and I will do these the traditional applique method. Let's get started on the jack-o'-lanterns. To open the files for the jack-o'-lanterns, you can go to the Merge Stitch File icon. However, I find it easier to open the file that contains all of your embroidery files. I am going to open the quilting bundle, and the jack-o'-lanterns take Halloween 9, block by block, and I need the 4x8 design. I will drag and drop it into the hoop. Now I will go back to the embroidery files and I will find the jack-o'-lanterns. I will drag and drop that into the hoop. Now, as I have before, I am going to delete a few steps of the background quilting. There are 5 steps and they are all the same steps in any of the block by block quilting. They are the placement for the batting, the tack down of the batting, the placement of the fabric, the tack down of the fabric, and then the background quilting. I do not need step 2, which is the tack down of the batting, because I cut my batting to the exact size. I also don't use step 3 because that is a placement line for the background fabric, and our fabric is cut much larger, and so this is a step that is not needed. So I will select step 2, hold my shift key down and select step 3 and hit delete on my keyboard. Again, that is a totally optional step. You can run all 5 steps of the quilting, or if you don't want to delete steps, you can skip those right at the machine while you're stitching the block out. Now there's one other thing that I'm going to do. I am right now in my 7x12 hoop, and I will be using my 9x14 inch hoop, and I am going to make some changes. And to make sure that that will work, I am going to change my hoop size. I think I will be using my 9x14 inch hoop. Right now I have the 7x12. So I will come up to this Preferences folder, select my 9x14 and select OK. Now I need to select both designs. I can drag a selection box over both designs. I can select on the right hand side the first, hold my shift key down and select the second. That will select both designs. Or on my Mac I will Command A and that will select both. Once I have those both selected, I am going to go to this icon, which is the rotate right, and that fits perfectly in my 9x14. So that is how I am going to save the file so that I can stitch it out on the 9x14. So now I will go to File, Save Stitch File As, and I will name my design. I will save it in my Combined Files folder, and then I will save it to my USB and take to my machine. I will go to Embroidery, to my USB, and to the Combined Files folder. I will scroll down and find my jack-o'-lantern block. I will set, and then embroidery. Now the last hoop that I used was my 7x12, which is the 8x12 of my machine. And remember, I changed this block sideways so I could use my 9x14. So I need to go to the settings and change to my 9x14 hoop. And okay. Now, of course, I have, again, all of my stabilizer down towards the bottom. It's still attached to the roll. So I want to move the design up to the very top so that I can use less stabilizer. So I will go to Layout and Move and use the up arrow and move it all the way to the top of my hoop and hit OK. And then I always like to go to this minus plus needle just if I need to skip or go back for some reason. And then of course I can see each step that I'm doing. So let's get these jack-o'-lanterns started. So you can see that when my tack down started, my bobbin for some reason did not catch. It caught, it looks like, the rest of the way, and I really need that tack down since that holds everything together while I'm doing embroidery. So I am going to just cut this loose thread. And this is a great way to show how to go back. I've showed a lot of times how to skip ahead, but let's look on how to get back because I want to run that first portion again. So I'll put my hoop back in. I will come over here where now it says I'm ready to do the quilting. So the down arrow would be to skip ahead, let's say past the quilting. So I need to use the up arrow and it will go back to the start of the tack down. I will go ahead and start it and then just manually stop my machine when it gets to the part that caught. So I don't need to go any further than that. So I will cut because I'm done. Now, if you look at the step over here, it still thinks that I need to finish that tack down because I started and I stopped about right here. So now this is where the down arrow comes in because I don't need to finish the rest. I will hit the down arrow and now it will go back to the quilting. So now I can continue. This jack-o'-lantern block has some orange and black leaves. And I have decided that instead of the black leaves, I am going to use my darker purple thread. Just another block to use my purple. Okay, this block, I did not take the basting out like I normally do, and I'm going to show you why in a minute. If I would have thought about this earlier, I would have put in a darker color so that that could be more easily seen. But this block needs to be cut to a final size of 4.5 by 8.5. But in the orange pop rulers, which I've been using, there is not a 4.5 by 8.5 size ruler. So in the directions, it says to use 2 of the rulers. This is the 4.5 by 6.5. And then the one that's just larger is a 6.5 by 8.5. So I'm going to first show what the directions state, because of course they use the Kimberbell orange pop rulers. And let me kind of show you how we'll be using these. The smaller 4.5 by 6.5 ruler will be the height of this block. It will not be the width, so we're not concerned about the size, because here is the basting on the left and here is the basting on the right. And you can tell that's just not the right size. It actually looks like it almost might be, but I measured this ruler and it's not, the outside measurement is not quite 8.5. So we're not concerned about the width of the block, only the height at this point. So what they tell you to do is using these basting on the top and the bottom, and that just helps center. You would line up the inside of the ruler with the top and the bottom. And again, I wish I would have used darker thread. And so then what you would do is you would cut just the bottom and just the top, not the sides. That would give you the height of the block. Then you would use this larger ruler. They actually showed a nest it, but I think that's a little bit more difficult. So once you would cut the top and the bottom, there would be slices to about right here. You would then use the width of this, because the width of this ruler, if you notice, goes from this basting to this basting. And actually, if you can see, this basting is actually a little bit inside, and that's why you don't automatically cut just to the basting, because you can see that this kind of, because of the quilting, kind of pulled in. So you wouldn't want to just cut that and assume that that's right. So you would take this, line it up the best you could, and then use the edges and cut the width of the block. That would leave a little section at the top, because remember this little one doesn't cut all the way out, so it would end about right here. That would leave 2 little pieces attached at the top and the bottom, and you could just use a regular ruler and just finish those cuts out. Now that might be confusing if you've never used pop rulers before, or maybe even if you have used these rulers. But let me show you a different way to use just a regular ruler. Now again, I mentioned this before, you don't just want to cut and assume that this basting stitch is the correct size. In theory it should be, but again, quilting and embroidering tends to pull the fabric in a little bit, and you can even see it on this one. This one kind of dips in. So I want to measure before I cut, and I'm going to hold this up so hopefully you can see. The height of the block from the top to the bottom needs to measure 4.5 inches. So I'm measuring from the top to the bottom with just a regular ruler before I cut, to make sure that those basting stitches are where I need to cut. So if I line my ruler up on here on the left, and if you look to the right, the basting stitch is just a hair in. So what I would do is cut to the outside of the top and the bottom of the block, and that would give me my 4.5 inch height. Now I would do the same thing for the width. Here is the basting. I need it to be 8.5 inch long, so I would put this right on the basting. And if you look, and I'm not sure you can see, but this is about 1/8. Where this dips in on this side is a little bit more than 1/8 shorter than the 8.5. So I can't just cut it on that line. So what I would do is I would move this left side over just a tiny bit outside of this line, and I would cut this side. Then before I cut this side, I would measure to 8.5 and then trim. And I'm going to go ahead and use the regular ruler, and you can do this on any block in case you don't use the orange pop rulers. So let's get this block cut. So my basting from the top and the bottom were pretty accurate. So the first thing I am going to do is line up just along this basting. So I will cut just barely outside of it. And remember, I didn't remove the basting, so I have all this excess stabilizer that I normally remove, but it's still there. So that's the top. Now, before I cut the side, one way that I probably would do this, especially if I'm doing all of the other blocks, is I would put this is our cut edge. I would put the 4.5 inch, because that's the size that we need the finished block to be. And I would line up the 4.5 along this side to make sure they're straight. And then I know that I'm exactly 4.5 inches. And I will show you in just a minute that it's just outside of that basting. Just barely, and I'm not sure if you can see it, but here is a little bit of the basting. So it was just outside. So I cut the top, measured 4.5 inches, and then cut the other side. And I'm going to do the same thing with the width. Now I will double check. Remember, if I line it just outside of the basting on the left side, I'm about 1/8 short. So I'm going to move it a little bit over, and I think that will be good. So I'm going to cut this side first. I'm going to turn it around, and I am going to go just outside. I need to make sure that I line up. I don't want to cut it crooked, of course, and I don't want to necessarily go by this, because you can see it does dip down. So first I'm going to come just slightly outside, and when I say slightly, I mean just less than 1/8 of an inch, just barely. I'm going to line up to make sure I have an even edge, because our top and bottom are straight, and I'm just outside. So I'm going to make my first cut on the left hand side. So now I have top, side, and bottom, and you can see on this one I did do it a little bit outside. Here's the basting. So I need to do the same thing, and here is the bottom that I just cut. I am going to line that up with the 8.5, because the block needs to be at 8.5. So first I'm going to line up that. I'm along the edge, so I know that I'm straight. So I'm straight along this edge. I'm at 8.5, lined up straight. So now when I flip this around, try to do it this way so you can see. So 8.5, we're lined up along the edge. So now I know that that's where I need to cut this. And this one, again, the sides pulled in, so I have a little bit of basting on this side and a little bit on that side. So now, if you look at the block, I will put it in the corner. My block measures 4.5 by 8.5, and that's exactly what this block needs to be. So this is what you can do with any block, no matter what size, if you don't use the orange pop rulers. You would just measure to make sure you get the height and just kind of work your way around and you'll be all set. Super cute.